My own father shoved me into a fountain in front of 300 wedding guests. I can still feel the sting of the cold water, the gasps turning into laughter, and the weight of humiliation pressing down on me. But what nobody knew was that in that exact moment, my life and theirs was about to change forever. Before I dive deeper into this story, let me ask you, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you've ever been treated like the black sheep in your family, hit that subscribe button, because you're about to hear how I turned years of shame into strength. Growing up, I was never the golden child. That title belonged to my younger sister, Allison. She could do no wrong, while I could never seem to do anything right. If she earned a trophy, it was displayed on the mantle. If I earned one, it disappeared into a box in the attic. My parents, especially my father, a powerful attorney, made it clear that Allison was the star of our family show. By the time I turned 32, I had built a career that would shock them all if they'd ever cared to ask, but I kept it hidden. After all, what good was sharing victories with people who only ever saw you as a disappointment? That's why, on the day of Allison's wedding, I walked into the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel with my head high but my guard up. I already knew I'd be seated at the farthest table, treated like a distant cousin instead of a daughter. I already knew there'd be whispers about my mysterious job and pitying smiles at my single status. What I didn't know was that my father, drunk on power, image, and champagne, would take things to a level even I couldn't imagine. With the microphone still in his hand and the entire room watching, he turned his ridicule into action. His hands shoved me backward, and I fell into the fountain. The crowd erupted in laughter. My sister smirked. My mother covered a smile with her hand. And for the first time in my life, standing there dripping wet, I realized something profound. I was done. Done seeking approval, done shrinking, done hiding who I really was. And that night, they would finally learn the truth. I stood in the hotel bathroom, staring at my reflection in the gold-framed mirror. Mascara streaked down my cheeks, hair plastered to my forehead, emerald dress soaked and clinging like a second skin. For years, moments like this had broken me, but tonight, something inside me shifted. I whispered to my own reflection, "Remember this moment, Meredith, because you're not shrinking anymore." That quiet promise was the turning point. I slipped into the spare black dress I always kept in my car, just another habit of a woman trained to prepare for the unexpected. As I brushed fresh powder across my face, I felt a strange calm wash over me. Not anger, not sadness, liberation. By the time I re-entered the ballroom, the party had roared back to life, but whispers still followed me like shadows. My mother, holding a flute of champagne, shot me a glance full of polished annoyance. "At least try to look like you're enjoying yourself," she hissed. "Don't embarrass us." I almost laughed. Me? Embarrass them? My father had shoved his grown daughter into a fountain, and somehow I was the disgrace. That realization hardened something inside me. Just then, my phone buzzed in my clutch. A message from Nathan. 10 minutes out. Security team already at the perimeter. Relief pulsed through me like a heartbeat. Nathan wasn't just my husband. He was the one person who saw me, truly saw me, without the filter of family disappointment. And when he arrived, the dynamic in that ballroom would never be the same again. I lingered near the entrance, watching as my father raised his glass once more, basking in the attention of his audience. He praised Allison's marriage, her beauty, her accomplishments, each word digging like a knife into wounds carved long ago. When he finally locked eyes with me, his voice sharpened. "Classic Meredith, always running, always failing, 32 years old and can't even find a date." The crowd tittered nervously. Some actually laughed. My mother's lips curled into a small, satisfied smile, and in that humiliating silence, something inside me snapped, not in rage but in clarity. I met my father's eyes and spoke so quietly that people leaned in to hear, "You have no idea who I am." He smirked, thinking it was just another weak protest. "Oh, I know exactly who you are. A disappointment." But the ballroom doors suddenly swung open, cutting off his triumph. 2 men in suits entered first, scanning the room with precision. A ripple of curiosity spread through the guests, and then Nathan appeared, tall, commanding. His presence seemed to shift the air itself. He walked with purpose, eyes locked on me, and for the first time all evening I felt safe. The room fell silent as whispers of recognition spread. "Isn't that Nathan Reed? The Billionaire tech CEO?" My mother's champagne flute trembled in her hand. My father's smirk faltered. And Nathan reached me, took my hand, and said, "Sorry I'm late." "You're right on time," I whispered. And with that, the balance of power in my family shifted forever. Nathan's hand was warm in mine, steadying me as if nothing and no one in that room could shake him. Around us, the wedding guests buzzed with curiosity, necks craning, whispers darting like sparks in dry grass. My mother was the first to recover her voice. She forced a laugh, too high, too brittle. "Meredith, dear, you never mentioned a husband." 3 years, Nathan said smoothly, his tone polite but razor-edged. "We married 3 years ago." I watched her painted smile freeze. The calculation in her eyes laid bare. It wasn't joy, not pride, but the dawning realization of what his presence meant, for their reputation, for their status. My father barged forward, face flushed red with anger. "What is this circus, Meredith? Hiring an actor to humiliate us at your sister's wedding? That's low, even for you." Nathan's blue eyes narrowed, and I felt his grip tighten around my waist, protective, unwavering. His voice dropped to a tone that carried more weight than any shout. "Mr. Campbell, I am Nathan Reed, CEO of Reed Technologies. Your daughter is my wife. I assure you this is no act." The room gasped in unison, as though they were one collective body suddenly deprived of oxygen. Someone near the back pulled out a phone and whispered, "He's on the Forbes list." Worth billions, I didn't need to look at my father to know his bravado was crumbling. His shoulders stiffened, his jaw twitched, but his eyes betrayed him, shifting, searching, uncertain for the first time. That was the moment I chose to step forward. "You always said I'd amount to nothing, that I'd never measure up. Well, Dad, tell me, what do you see now?" He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence was broken by my sister. Allison floated closer in her gown, face pale, voice sharp. "This is my wedding day, Meredith. You just had to make it about you, didn't you?" I turned to her, strangely calm. "I didn't push myself into that fountain, Allison. I didn't create this spectacle. Your father did that when he decided humiliating me mattered more than honoring you." For once, she had no clever retort. Her mouth snapped shut, and Bradford, her new husband, shifted uncomfortably at her side. Before anyone could respond, the ballroom doors opened again. 2 figures in tailored suits strode in with urgency, and my heart skipped. I knew that posture, that alertness. FBI colleagues. "Director Campbell," one of them said formally, stopping a respectful distance away, "we need your authorization." A ripple of shock coursed through the crowd. "Director? FBI?" The whispers grew louder, pressing against the chandeliers. My father blinked, visibly rattled. "Director of what? Some minor office?" Nathan's voice cut through like a blade. "Your daughter is the youngest deputy director of counterintelligence in FBI history." Gasps erupted. Glasses clinked. My mother swayed, catching herself on a chair. Allison's face drained of color. I looked directly at my father and said softly, "For years, you told me I was nothing. Tonight, you found out who I really am." The ballroom stilled. No laughter, no whispers, just the weight of truth pressing down. My father's mouth opened, then closed. For a man who built his empire on words, he suddenly had none. The attorney, the patriarch, the self-styled judge of all my failures, reduced to silence by a truth he could neither deny nor control. The turning point had come. Nathan slipped his arm around me and added, "And here's the part you need to understand, Mr. Campbell. If anyone ever treats my wife that way again, I won't be as patient as she was tonight." His words weren't shouted, but the steel in his tone left no doubt. I felt the room shift, their pity gone, replaced by awe, maybe even respect. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the family embarrassment. I was the storm they hadn't seen coming, and yet I didn't smile in triumph. I only felt free. I turned to my mother, her hands trembling around her glass. "You always said appearances matter more than anything. Well, now you have them. But you'll never again control me with your silence or your shame." The words left me lighter, as though the weight of decades had been lifted from my shoulders. Nathan leaned close, whispering just for me, "Ready to go?" I nodded. "Yes. I think it's time," and together we walked out of that ballroom, leaving the Campbells drowning in the wreckage of their illusions. The cool night air hit me as Nathan and I stepped onto the rooftop terrace, security flanking us on either side. The low thrum of helicopter blades grew louder, whipping my damp hair back from my face. I felt lighter than I had in years, as though the weight of decades of shame had finally been cut loose. "Are you okay?" Nathan asked, his hand firm against my back. "Better than okay," I answered, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. Just then, footsteps pounded against the stone stairs. I turned to see my mother, still in her pale blue gown, makeup cracked at the edges, chest heaving as though she'd climbed the entire hotel. For the first time, she didn't look like the untouchable matriarch of my childhood. She looked human, almost fragile. "Meredith," she called out, breathless. "You can't just leave." "We need to talk." I stiffened. The girl inside me, the one who'd spent years aching for approval, wanted to lean in, but the woman I'd become knew better. "I have a national security emergency, Mother," I said evenly. "The world doesn't wait for family reconciliations." Her eyes flickered, as though she'd just heard the words for the first time. "National security," she repeated softly. "So it's true. You really are who they said." I held her gaze. "Deputy Director of Counterintelligence. 18 months now." She swayed slightly, gripping the railing. "Why didn't you tell us?" I almost laughed at the absurdity. "Would you have believed me? Or would you have found a way to dismiss it, like you always did?" She flinched, and for a fleeting second, I saw something break in her eyes. "I admit," she whispered, "what your father did tonight was unforgivable." That was the turning point. For 32 years, I had waited for even the smallest acknowledgement of their cruelty, and now, standing beneath the roar of the helicopter blades, I finally heard it. Not an apology. Not yet, but the closest she had ever come. "Thank you," I said quietly. "But words are only words, Mother. You'll have to decide if you want to know me for who I really am, or just the version of me that finally makes you look good." She pressed her lips together, struggling. For the first time, there was no quick retort, no polished dismissal, just silence. Nathan squeezed my hand, signaling it was time. The pilot gestured urgently from the cockpit. As we walked toward the helicopter, I glanced back one last time. My mother stood alone against the skyline, a diminished figure dwarfed by Boston's glittering towers. For the first time, I didn't see her as a queen. I saw her as a woman clinging desperately to the crumbling image she had built her whole life around. And strangely, I felt something close to compassion. The ride across the city was brief, the lights of Boston sprawling like constellations beneath us. Nathan sat beside me, his arm draped protectively around my shoulders. Neither of us spoke. Words felt unnecessary. When the helicopter touched down at the embassy, duty pulled me back into focus. Briefings, encrypted communications, and crisis management consumed the next 2 hours. But even as I navigated the chaos, the rooftop conversation replayed in my mind. Her voice, unsteady. Her admission, raw. Unforgivable. Later, back at our penthouse overlooking the Charles River, I stood barefoot on the balcony, the city glittering below. Nathan came up behind me, wrapping me in his arms. "You're still thinking about her," he said softly. "I am," I admitted, because tonight was the first time I saw her crack. The first time I heard something real. Nathan kissed the top of my head. "Cracks let the light in." But it doesn't mean you have to step back into the shadows. I leaned into him, my heart calmer than it had been in years. I know. I'm not chasing their approval anymore, but maybe, just maybe, this is the start of something different. He didn't push, didn't offer false promises. He just held me. And in that silence, I realized that healing doesn't begin with the people who hurt you. It begins with yourself. And for the first time, I believed I was strong enough to choose what came next. The days after the wedding felt like stepping into an alternate universe. For years, my phone had been silent. No birthday calls, no holiday texts, no invitations. But suddenly, it wouldn't stop buzzing. Cousins I barely knew messaged me. We should catch up soon. Second cousins asked about lunch dates. Even distant relatives tried to reconnect. And then came my father's text, formal, stiff. We need to discuss recent developments at your earliest convenience. I stared at the screen, a bitter laugh slipping out. They're not reaching out to me, I told Nathan one night as we sat on our balcony overlooking the Charles River. They're reaching out to Director Campbell, wife of billionaire Nathan Reed. Nathan, calm as always, squeezed my hand. That doesn't mean you owe them anything. His words were steady, grounding. Still, a small part of me wondered, was this finally the crack I'd been waiting for? The turning point came 2 weeks later when my mother called. Her voice, usually polished and sharp, sounded hesitant. Meredith, we'd like to invite you and Nathan to Sunday dinner. Just the family. For a long moment, I didn't answer. Then I said carefully, if we come, there will be conditions. No belittling, no comparisons, no rewriting history. There was silence on the line before she whispered, I understand. That acknowledgement, however faint, was more than I'd ever received. Transitioning back into their orbit wasn't easy. The first dinner was tense. My father oscillated between defensive justifications and awkward attempts at interest. My mother overcompensated, describing every dish on the table as if she were hosting foreign dignitaries. Allison arrived late, still glowing from her honeymoon, but her smile faltered when she saw Nathan sitting confidently at my side. And yet, there were moments, brief flickers of something almost human. My father asked Nathan a thoughtful question about cybersecurity, an actual question, not a veiled insult. My mother brought out a box I'd never seen before, debate trophies, science medals, evidence she had kept pieces of my childhood even while pretending not to notice. Later, Allison asked to speak privately in the garden. Her voice trembled as she admitted, I think I liked being the favorite. It was easier not to question it, but maybe it's time I do. Her honesty startled me. For once, she wasn't the golden child basking in the spotlight. She was just my sister, uncertain, flawed, reaching out. I didn't forgive her then. But I said softly, maybe that's a start. Walking back to Nathan that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Not reconciliation, not yet, but the faint outline of possibility. Healing, I realized, doesn't arrive in a thunderclap. It comes in slow, uneven steps. And for the first time, my family had taken one. 1 year after that unforgettable wedding, I stood in my own kitchen surrounded by people who truly mattered. Nathan's sister, my trusted colleagues from the bureau, even Emma, the cousin-in-law who had offered me kindness when I was dripping wet and humiliated. My parents were there too, quieter now, more careful with their words. Allison laughed at something Bradford said, and for the first time, her laughter didn't sting. It wasn't perfect. It would never be. But it was real in a way it had never been before. Looking around, I realized something profound. Family isn't defined by blood or last names. Family is who shows up, who sees you clearly, who celebrates you without comparison and stands by you without conditions. Sometimes that includes the people you're born to. Often, it doesn't. For decades, I chased scraps of approval from people who never intended to give it. It took a fountain, a ruined dress, and the courage to say, remember this moment, to finally understand. I don't need their approval anymore. I've learned that forgiveness is less about letting them back in and more about letting yourself move forward without the weight of bitterness. Boundaries aren't walls to keep love out. They're doors you choose when and if to open. So if you've ever been called the disappointment, the failure, the black sheep, hear me now. Your worth isn't defined by those who refuse to see it. It's defined by the strength you carry, the love you give, and the people who choose you for exactly who you are. If this story resonates with you, hit subscribe and share where you're watching from, because maybe, just maybe, your story of healing starts today.